Is the earnest money deposit refundable? Well, it depends, and I'll explain. First, an earnest money deposit is typically 1 to 3% of the sales price, and the buyer delivers it to escrow at the beginning of a transaction. Now, sometimes we're asked, is an earnest money deposit required? I imagine that theoretically, somehow, somewhere, you could do a transaction without an EMD, but I would never recommend it. So for all intents and purposes, I would say yes, the earnest money deposit, or EMD as we call it, is required. Now, is it refundable? Well, a buyer has contingency periods built into a contract. And these contingency periods basically give the buyer time to see if they can get their loan and do property inspections and really investigate the property to see if they're going to purchase it without their deposit being on the line. It's refundable throughout these contingency periods. And the longest contingency period is 21 days. Now, these can be altered, but we're going off what's standard in a contract. So the standard verbiage says 21 days for a contingency period. Now, if the buyer cancels within that 21 days, then both parties know that that deposit is refundable. The earnest money deposit is assumed to be refunded to the buyer. Now, what happens if the buyer cancels on day 22? Well, that depends too, because contingencies don't automatically expire. They don't automatically go away. A buyer has to remove contingencies in writing, or else they stay in place indefinitely. So even though the buyer may only have 21 days of inspection or contingency periods on the purchase contract, on day 22, if the buyer hasn't removed these contingencies, then they continue. And the buyer can cancel and be entitled to a refundable earnest money deposit. And this can go on to day 23, day 24, indefinitely, even day 30. If the buyer hasn't removed contingencies, then their deposit is refundable. This is why it's incumbent on a seller to ask the buyer to remove contingencies when their period expires, because the seller needs to hold the buyer accountable and make sure the deposit becomes non-refundable so the buyer really has skin in the game. Now, what happens if a buyer removes all contingencies and then cancels or can't close for whatever reason? Well, that's tough, because once those contingencies are removed, the deposit's essentially non-refundable, and the buyers will likely ask the seller to surrender their deposit if contingencies have been removed and the buyer can't close for whatever reason. So what typically happens in the real world is usually the parties will negotiate, and sometimes they negotiate splitting the deposit. Sometimes the seller demands the entire deposit. And if both parties can't come to an agreement about releasing that deposit to the seller or refunding it to the buyer or splitting it some way, then it's just going to sit in escrow. And it's going to sit in escrow until escrow gets one of two things. Either both parties have to sign instructions releasing the deposit to either party or splitting it or whatever they decide, or one party has to deliver a court order to escrow. Now, in the purchase contract, there's a stipulation where, let's say the buyer can't close escrow, the deposit's just sitting there in escrow, the seller's angry and saying, hey, buyer, you breached. I want your deposit because I just spent 4 weeks waiting for you to do this and was inconvenienced, etc. Well, that seller can deliver a notice to escrow. Basically, it's a demand to release the deposit. And then escrow can then turn to the buyer and demand and deliver that demand to release deposit. Supposedly, and I'll tell you why I'm saying supposedly in a second, but supposedly if the buyer does not dispute the seller's demand to release a deposit, then after 10 days, escrow can release that deposit to the seller. So the reason I said supposedly is because I don't know any escrow in their right mind, although I'm sure one might exist, but any proper escrow should require both parties sign off on instructions to release a deposit. I used to own an escrow company, and there's no way I would go off this verbiage in the purchase contract where if one buyer doesn't dispute, or pardon me, if one party doesn't dispute the other party's demand for the deposit, that after 10 days, then I just release it. To me, that's crazy and reckless. What typically happens is escrow has to sit with the deposit again until either they have instructions signed by both parties or a court order. Now, what happens if a seller, just to be petty, holds that deposit in escrow and refuses to release it to the buyer? Well, there's a California law that says that if one party does not release that deposit to the party it's due within 30 days, then that party that's not releasing, that stubborn party, is subject to a civil penalty up to $1,000. And this ensures that if there's any sort of dispute regarding the deposit, it's done in good faith and there's a reason behind it, and that the parties are going to quickly seek a resolution rather than one party act petty and hold that money ransom in escrow. And that's also a burden on escrow. So when it comes down to it, and to summarize and make it all very simple, the deposit's refundable so long as there are contingencies in place. A seller should enforce contingency removal, because until they're removed, the deposit is refundable. Now, once contingencies are removed, the deposit is then non-refundable. Now, often if a buyer breaches or can't close and parties have to negotiate, sellers a lot of times will walk away or concede the deposit, even though if they fought in court, they could probably get it. Why? Because the seller just wants to sell their home and they don't want to spend months chasing down a deposit when that could prevent them from moving forward with another buyer. So if you have more questions about this, please email info@balboateam.com. Thank you for watching.